Welcome to Tonebender's Sound Design Podcast, presented by Sound Ideas. This is the show where we talk with the sonic artists behind our favorite films, games, and series. Sound Ideas annual memberships put Sound Ideas' full range of over 600,000 sound effects, music tracks, and production elements at your fingertips, with 3 tiers to choose from based on your sound design needs. The Creator's Access Plan is perfect for the independent creator working on a smaller scale, looking for high-quality sound options at a great price. With up to 100 downloads, you'll enjoy significant savings compared to buying individual sounds. And you'll have free reign over Sound Ideas' extensive collection. Use the promo code TONEBENDERS50 for 50% off any Sound Ideas annual membership to amplify your future productions. Hello and welcome to Tonebender's Sound Design Podcast. My name is Tim Muirhead and I will be your host as we go way back in time to talk about Becoming Led Zeppelin, the new documentary about the first few years of the legendary band's existence. The doc spends a good chunk of time letting the audience know each of the 4 members, where they came from, what their musical background was, and how they met. And then the film shifts a bit to include full performances of some of their early classics to let us really understand what made them special as they rose to fame. Joining me today to talk about his work on the film is Nick Bergh. Nick was a supervising sound editor and re-recording mixer on Becoming Led Zeppelin. I have so many questions for you today, Nick. Welcome to Tonebenders. It's great to meet you.
It's great to be here, Tim. Thank you.
There's been hundreds, probably, documentaries about Led Zeppelin, but they've all just kind of crammed together pre-existing interviews and such. How did this film come to be that the band was on board and part of the project?
That's really the great work of the director, Bergh, and Allison, the producer. The way I understand it is we had done this earlier project together, American Epic, that really focused on the beginning of country music and blues and early sound recording in the late 20s and early 30s. You know, that's right up their alley as far as blues history and that sort of thing. And so they were aware of that project. And so they were a lot more receptive, not only the understanding of that history, but also the care that was taken in the visuals and the interviews and the sound quality as well of that project. And I think that was probably a big thing that helped move that forward. But really, that was Bergh and Allison that really were able to make that happen, and I came on a little after.
There's a reason that you were chosen for this project and for American Epic as well, and that's because you're not just a sound supervisor. You run a place called Endpoint Audio that specializes in archiving, or unarchiving maybe might be a better way to say it. Do you want to tell us a bit about why you were the right man for this job?
Well, I mean, I
Don't be humble, come on.
Yeah, So I'm not a typical sound supervisor, re-recording mixer, and I have utmost respect for all those people who are able to do that stuff day in and day out. I'm a lot more of a restoration and remastering engineer, and a lot more on the technical side. So with a lot of these films, we had this kind of history already from American Epic. They were aware of the lengths that I took to get the sound right on that film. So they wanted to try to use that as much as they could on this film. I would say, one of the things that I often offer is being able to do experiments and, trying new things. So, anytime I take on something new or do something a little different, I want to always prove to myself the best way to do it. Even coming down to plugins and all that. I mean, I'll just start as if I have never done it before again and just reconfirm to myself, this is the best way. And so I like to do that in all these projects. So we're using a lot of records in the sound of this project. And that was luckily, something that I'd already done a lot of R&D on for American Epic to extract the sound on those records that were done for the box set and all that. And also, how we went about the restoration and that kind of thing at the time. But in this film, there was a lot of reanalyzing, what we kind of take for granted in the mix workflow, and even, going to IMAX. We were just expecting to kind of hand this off for an IMAX mix. But when we, got into that, we preferred to do it all in-house. And the IMAX folks were great to allow all that. So that was, a very interesting process as well to make sure that what was going to IMAX is really what was being captured initially.
You mentioned that a lot of the sound for this film came from vinyl. If you just said that to me out of nowhere, I'd think, okay, he walked over to the shelf in his bedroom there and got the old Led Zeppelin 2 album out, put it on the needle, and hit record. Way more lengths were gone to. Do you want to talk about how extensive the search to find the perfect version of all these songs you went through?
So with the director and with myself and the editor, Dan and Allison, I mean, the film has always kind of been thought of as a musical, so that the music is kind of like a character in the film as well. So even from the beginning, there was a lot of effort to like confirm, how each piece is going to be represented and that sort of thing. So at the very beginning, we did a lot of experimentation as far as, all the sources we had available to us, digital sources, tape sources, disc sources. The conclusion came pretty quick that the discs themselves offer a lot of advantages. And so we just went all in on that. So anything that's a commercial recording in the film is from a record. The only thing that's not from record is typically the live performances that were coming off of video or film or things like that. So it offers a number of advantages. First of all, it's a documentary film, and it's great to kind of be able to show the audience what was actually heard at the time. So because what's on the tape is not fully baked. It was expecting to be mastered on vinyl and
on the master tapes, you mean, like from the recording studio?
Yeah. So what's on these tapes is rarely the same as what actually ended up on the record. Kind of extreme examples of this are things like the chess records, the blues records and things like that, where almost all those records, the master tapes are dry. They were only adding reverb in the cutting room. And, that reverb is, the staircase at Chess Records in Chicago. And so you will never remaster that tape to sound exactly like what people heard at the time, as much as you try. I mean, you'd have to kind of model the stairway and do all these things. But so that's kind of an extreme example. But all these are kind of like that, where, they were using, particular limiters and EQs and that sort of thing. Using the record, you're able to kind of show exactly what people heard at the time. The other kind of, side thing about that is that, again, the tape is not fully ready. It needs some remastering. So when they did the digital reissues, the band was involved, helping that out to confirming the sound and all that. When this is going to be used for the film, I mean, I essentially have to inject myself into that process and make decisions, and by, only using the records, I can sidestep all of that. And, for example, like Led Zeppelin 2, it was Bob Ludwig who did the cutting on the disc we use, and who am I to fix what was already done by him, and so it's just a nice way to kind of, sidestep that as well and really show what was done. And the other thing I like about it is that a lot of people, can have a misimpression about what's going on in restoration and remastering these days, as far as us, using new tools and things to make things better, right? But usually it's not the case. I mean, usually the sound is already baked into the source. And, restoration's really about taking out anomalies and things that would distract from the music today. So it's great to be able to put something out there and say, this is not from 2025 technology. These musicians and these engineers made this thing that you're hearing exactly. All we're doing is dusting it off so you can hear it in the best way possible. But it's not the result of modern digital technology that you're hearing this great sound. It's from them, not us.
The Led Zeppelin albums have different mastering and different lacquer plates made based on what continent they were purchased in, who is mastering it. So they all sound slightly different. How did you decide which ones to go with?
Yeah, so the most dramatic of these is Led Zeppelin 1. I mean, it's pretty remarkable. So I had to, that thing was cut at least probably 6 different times. And it's remarkable how different they are between the cuts. So, someone could buy that album and say, oh, this is the best sounding record I've heard. And someone could buy the exact same album and say, oh, this album sounds terrible. And they would both be absolutely right. I mean, from a sound quality, side. Part of the problem seems to be that the master tape was made so the recording azimuth is off. So the head was misaligned in the recording. How effective the mastering was, usually comes down to how clever the mastering engineer was at fixing that problem. So some of them they didn't notice at all or didn't fix it at all. So there's severe high frequency loss, phase error, and even some comb filtering going on just because the azimuth is so far off on the tape. In other ones, they were able to dial it in exactly, and it just sounds great.
And then the volume of the mastering changed things as well for you, right? Because some pressings were way louder than other pressings.
I mean, there's definitely choices that were going on in that sense. Typically, we were more after the overall sound quality because we could adjust the levels we need to. But things like Led Zeppelin 2, level comes into that because the first great cut by Bob Ludwig was essentially rejected because it was too loud and too hard for the record players to play back then. And so they had to do kind of a second rate cutting after that. And, speaking with him, I've talked to him afterwards, and it always kind of, hurt him after all these decades that they didn't come back to him and just say, hey, can you, cut it differently or whatever. They kind of went an entirely different way. But those two records are very different, and his, just sounds incredible.
I'm sorry to keep talking about vinyl, but I find this stuff endlessly fascinating. So with a record player with a swing arm, you'll be able to explain this better than I can, but I'm going to try and set you up. The swing is kind of an average for the whole side of the record. There's only certain parts where it's actually fully correct. But you were able, when transferring, to make adjustments for each song based on where it is on the vinyl to correct for that. Am I getting that right?
So when the record is cut, the cutting lathe is going across in a straight line. But when we typically play it back, we're swinging the tone arm in an arc. And there have been, a number of high-end turntables that will play the record in a straight line in the same way that it's cut, but they induce other issues that are less than ideal. So the swing arm is still the best way to extract the sound quality, but you do have this problem of air because of the arc. So, typically the tone arm gets aligned so that it's kind of an average, so that it's not off in any area great deal, and so it works out. But that's typical just for playing a record at home. Of course, you don't want to do a lot of these fiddly things, but if we're remastering and doing restoration, we don't have to play the whole thing directly head to tail. I can, take each track on its own and set up specifically for that track. So, there's like a little, like a grid, essentially, you can set down to see where the cartridge is hitting on the record and then adjust the angle so that for that track, it's ideal.
I find that really fascinating. I've never really just thought about it like that before. It makes perfect sense once you think about it. But as you're, throwing a record on, you're just wanting to listen to some songs. You're not thinking that it's 0.67% off of beginning and last song kind of thing. That's really fascinating to me. So we've talked a bit about the vinyl restoration or transfers, I guess. Another major part of the film is that obviously Led Zeppelin had 4 members and only 3 are still alive today. It becomes both a narrative and a technical problem to how do we include John Bonham in this documentary when the other 3 are giving us really intimate personal accounts. And also, as I mentioned earlier, there's been lots of documentaries that have cobbled together previous interviews, but this one feels like it needed something new for John, and you found it. Do you want to talk about how you found it, how you actually got it, and what kind of processing or cleaning up it might have needed?
With all this kind of restoration stuff, even for vintage films and general projects, there's always this kind of circular workflow where something will come in, and then I'll have to say this is not good enough. Keep looking or whatever. That kind of thing. So this was a recording. There was some bootleg audio that was floating around. They wanted to use that, but it has to essentially be a stand-in for a modern interview because the other band members are being interviewed now. And so, there's kind of like a quality floor in a way. I mean, it has to be almost on par with that to be able to kind of go back between them. So Bergh, the director, luckily over the years that we've been working on this project, been slowly kind of whittling away, trying to locate the original for this old recording. And it turned out that it was done by an Australian. It was for a radio show, I believe. And so the master ended up back in Australia in an archive down there. And so they had to search through, thousands and thousands of tapes to be able to find this one thing. But it is just so important, being able to go back to the master is really the key, because even if they had like a secondary copy, you can improve the sound quality a lot, but you really can't extract that magic to help them come back alive, and hear all the nuances of their voice and things like that.
The real magical thing about hearing John Bonham's voice, a lot of the time in the film when we're hearing him talk, what we're seeing is one of the other band members listening to him talk. And they're having like facial tics and like sudden smiles and stuff. And it's a really affecting way of doing it, that you're right. If it was a real scratchy, hard to hear thing, that intimacy of seeing their reactions wouldn't work nearly as well.
Yeah. And I'm always amazed just because I, work on, a lot of this old audio, how compelling old audio can still be. I mean, even going back earlier decades, I mean, if it's transferred well, it can be extremely compelling still.
I'm going to take us a bit on a tangent. This isn't in the film, but I heard a story about what was originally the opening of the film. The sound of the Zeppelin exploding, that's a photo, is the cover of Zeppelin 1. You were able to get your hands on the original. Was it a cylinder, I guess?
Oh, no, it was a lacquer discs.
A lacquer disc, okay.
There's a few lacquer discs that were covering the landing of the Hindenburg, but there was one in particular that has the crash and the explosion on it.
You were able to restore the sound of the explosion, which had never been played. It had always just been a sound effect on the newsreels and such.
Part of the issue is there was a great researcher who talked about these discs in their PhD dissertation. They were allowed to look at them at the National Archives, but not with a microscope or anything, just by their eye. At the location of the explosion on the disc, he was just kind of going by the time on the disc. There's a big gouge in the recording. The conclusion was always that the explosion was so loud that it kicked the cutter head up from the record, and so it was never recorded because none of the other transfers before that had captured the explosion. Investigating here, what that big gouge was actually them attempting to play it back at the time. So when NBC tried to play back the explosion, it kicked their old tone arm up. The stylus was almost like a nail back then in the 1930s, and it really just, gouged the record right there. So under that gouge, the explosion was still there. Through the microscope here, I could actually see how big the groove excursion was. I could see that it was there. So when these discs were brought out here, they're essentially almost, hand-delivered here by the National Archives. So they were, here, witnessing the whole thing and approving things as I was going. So I had to say to them, I can see this explosion. Do I have your permission to go after it and try to get it? And they of course agreed, and we went for it. So it was a challenging thing where I had to essentially, go into the explosion, forwards, and then go into the explosion backwards. And then there was another section where I essentially had to parachute into the groove because it was untrackable, and then put it together.
Wow, that's amazing. That's like a real piece of history that you were able to unarchive there. That's amazing.
Yeah, and it's always, incredible just handling this material too because of the history of it and the importance. But not only were we able to grab the explosion, but the fidelity of the new transfer is far better as well. And so you hear a lot of the detail of just the propellers on the Hindenburg and what's kind of going around or whatever. And so between that audio, the new kind of high fidelity audio, and their 4K scans of the picture, because usually if you watch the picture, it's kind of like a doopy print that's been scanned or whatever. But in the new 4K scans, you can see people jumping out of the windows. I mean, it's that clear that you can see all this detail. And so as soon as this like high fidelity image and sound went in, it's like, whoa, this is too much. Unfortunately, it had to get extracted from the film, but hopefully, I think they're hoping to release it on its own somehow.
It's interesting how when we watch the old grainy footage of the Hindenburg crash and we hear the scratchy sound, our brains let us not think about the actual horror of the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But if you clean that up with the 4K scan and suddenly hear the people's screams, it's too real. That's what you found, right?
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. For the opening of a music documentary, it's just too much. So even though we went to those kind of lengths, but I mean, it's a good example of just the workflow through the film. For every piece of music, it was at that level through the film. Like what is the best possible source? How do we get it? And what is the best way to extract it? So going back to the John Bonham tape and the discs and everything, it's really it's one thing to find the recording, but then again, you need to, extract that audio in the best way possible. So, things here are a little bit backwards. I mean, typically, as in film sound kind of, workflow or whatever, machine room recordists is usually, a low end, kind of work their way up, to editing and re-recording and supervising, that sort of thing. But in a film like this, the magic really happens in the machine room, so it's kind of flipped. Can't imagine not personally transferring and overseeing that original audio, because it doesn't matter what you do. As soon as it gets into Pro Tools, that sound quality is baked in. So you can, take out ticks or hiss or whatever, but you can never improve the fidelity. The fidelity is really kind of burned in at the beginning.
I read that there was 78 RPM records. There's 16 millimeter optical film, 35 millimeter optical, 16 millimeter mag, 35 millimeter mag, 1 inch, 2 inch video, 45 RPM singles, lacquer discs, and various types of video formats. So like you were pulling stuff in from everywhere. What happens a lot of time in archival type things is that everything gets pulled in and it almost all just starts kind of sounding the same. Where here, everything, you can tell that everything isn't the same. Like there's personalities in the kind of audio we're hearing.
It was good that came through, so thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, with all these audio formats, there are often a lot of disadvantages, for each format, but often they have advantages too. And so it's really important in the work that I do to identify what those advantages are, and try to preserve those, because maybe the high frequency response is horrible, and on a particular format, but it has other qualities like, fast transient response or great low end response. And you really want to try to, maximize those as much as you can, each element. They have their own kind of personality in a way because, it's optical sound. You're not trying to, make it sound like mag or make it sound like a record or something. You try to, stay true to it, but get out the good qualities as much as you're able to.
We've kind of danced around it a bit. I asked you about it earlier, but Endpoint Audio, where you work, specializes in transfers and restoration, correct?
Yeah. So it is sort of kind of a backwards place as well because I do restoration work here, but I believe in doing the least amount of restoration as humanly possible. So my focus is always really on the analog side. So I'm trying to always, design equipment. I build a lot of equipment here and I modify equipment, come up with various ways so that, when it gets digitized, that is close to the final as possible. And then, it's really just kind of like a remastering job. So it was less about kind of like fixing something is really, helping it to translate to modern speakers and to modern environment. So I actually keep a lot of vintage speakers here as well, especially theatrical speakers. And it's really great sometimes, especially for, clients to be able to hear what these old soundtracks sounded like on these old speakers. Because if you do a really great transfer, you can play this raw audio through these speakers and amplifier systems, and the audio is still compelling. It still holds up in this fantastic way. So often it's really about translating that sound and that kind of emotional impact to our new systems or whatever. So say, for example, there's often like a steep high frequency roll off on the old speakers, the theatrical speakers. So if you just play something straight, there's going to be a bit more hiss coming through than they would have heard at the time. And so you don't want to, show off that hiss because they didn't actually hear it at the time. And so, the restoration is just kind of, remastering and trying to translate something that was great then to make it great again.
At Endpoint, you have all of the different formats I listed. like you're doing the transfer, right?
Yeah.
Just looking behind you right now, I can see lots of really cool stuff along the walls, and some of the vintage speakers are mounted up there. How many different kinds of formats could you transfer?
Oh, yeah. I mean, as far as, transfer stuff, especially, I've been doing that for decades, for hundreds of different projects. And so 60 different formats, something, like that. Because I also get involved in, along with commercial films and music, I'm also fairly involved in culturally important sound recordings that are often very challenging. For example, the Native American recordings. I'm doing a big project now of World War II sound recordings. So these kind of recordings are, highly compromised on very difficult media. For example, wire recordings, grooved film recordings, Tape it's called, wax recordings, Edison wax recordings. On those, you usually have to build kind of custom equipment to extract the sound in the best way possible. It's really about, getting as much as you can out of it, trying to present that in a great way to the audience. So, for example, I would say 60% or more, the sound of the film is mono. And we tried to, keep that, strong impact of the mono as much as we could as well. So, we are, filling in the sound around to fill up the theater, but, the focus is really on the mono.
Well, that's an interesting question. Just the idea of taking a mono sound to fill an IMAX theater. IMAX prides themselves, one of their biggest selling points is that they've got, a million speakers all around, and then you're coming in there with this mono track of these amazing sounds. Do you want to talk about how you approach that?
With the IMAX folks, I mean, it's great how open and receptive they were, because definitely when we came in there, they were, their eyebrows raised a little bit like, wait, what do you want to do? And so it was great at the end of the day that they allowed us, to do what we did. And so even the IMAX, process was really kind of a remastering process for me to try to get what we had already approved just to translate in the IMAX, realm. They kind of let me look under the hood and sign an NDA so I could see exactly what was, happening and tailor the remastering to, match that exactly, For example, one interesting thing going on in this film that probably shows up less in other films is that between John Bonham's kick drum and John Paul Jones's bass lines, the low end is incredibly intricate, and fast. Instead of a double basses in the score or something, I mean, there's, 30-second notes on a kick drum. This has a lot of implications for phase. All through this process, phase was critical in keeping, time alignment through the whole process from the record all the way to IMAX. And, it's amazing how what the smallest phase error, does to that rhythm section. It's even hard to see it on a scope or measure anything. It's primarily musical. I mean, it sounds like they've just had 5 beers or something, if the phase is off, it's just, they're playing all the notes, everything is okay, but it's just not locked in, But if you're really careful about the low end phase and that stuff it just, locks in perfectly. So we had to do a lot of experiments in that sense as well.
There's a great line in the film where John Paul Jones says, I'm going to misquote him, but I had a long, loving relationship with John Bonham's right foot.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's a really kind of incredible test signal in a way, because I'm always, doing experiments with different test signals and, that sort of a very intricate low end, really puts tests on kind of, what's going on with the LFE track and, things like that.
Well, I got to tell you, you seem to have about the coolest job in the world. It sounds like you're in there just experimenting away and getting to play with all these amazing old sounds and figuring it out. I'm very jealous of the career that you've managed to find for yourself and the way you've made yourself unique. It's really impressive.
Oh, well, thank you very much. It is frustrating as well sometimes because, sometimes, you are confronted with a problem, and it feels like there should be a solution to it. And, often it can take weeks to come there. I mean, even with some of the work we were doing in the IMAX conversion, it was probably a couple of weeks of, doing tests, going down their location, hearing them to get a sense of what was actually happening and how we could maximize the sound for that. So for each of these, I really try to dive in and make an opportunity to learn as I'm going through each project.
Before we wrap up, I just want to tell you a bit about my experience watching the film. I got to go see it in IMAX here in Toronto. It was a nearly sold-out screening. The film started, and within 10 minutes of it starting, people were smoking weed in the theater, which is fully illegal. They could have been kicked out, but no one ratted them out. We were all just like, this is a Led Zeppelin movie, of course, like, smoke it up. When we got into the full performances of songs, the end of them, people were cheering and clapping. It was almost like a live music experience as much as an IMAX screening can be. It was way more than I bargained for when I went to see the film. And it's because the film brings that out in you. It's such an intimate feeling, and it makes you feel like you're seeing things you're almost not meant to see, if that makes sense, but in a good way. I really enjoyed the film. I got a lot more out of it than I was expecting. So thank you very much for all that hard, intricate work you put in, making sure that the bass translates, because it really made everybody in the theater feel like we were all at one big important event. It was awesome.
Thanks for all that. It's important, too, to shout out the other people in the group as well. So Dan Gitlin did the amazing editing.
Picture editing.
Yeah, picture editing, but sound editing as well in the Avid and getting a lot of that stuff squared away. The director, Bergh McMahon, was always integral into kind of, he's open to new ideas. If you tell him, I think I can get 5% more out of this, it's often doesn't seem like a lot to people, but, he's always go for it, do it. I want that 5%. It's really fantastic having support like that to do things.
Well, I think that it set some kind of record for most money per screen in IMAX in England when it was released. It just got released here in North America, and it's going to be on streaming or digital soon. So everybody listening, keep your eye out. If you still have a chance to see it in theater, please do. But make sure you go see this. If you are at all interested in the history of rock and roll, never mind Led Zeppelin, this is a must see. Thanks for joining me today, Nick. It was great talking to you.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
That was a fun talk, a little bit different than our usual conversations. Big thanks to Nick for joining me today. You may have noticed that Tonebenders disappeared from your feed for a little bit. I had put out a weekly episode for 36 straight weeks since early July last summer, and I needed a little bit of a break. So thanks for bearing with me. The episodes will be coming out weekly again for a good run ahead, so stay tuned. My name's Tim Muirhead. Thanks for listening to Tonebenders. Sound Idea's annual memberships put Sound Idea's full range of over 600,000 sound effects, music tracks, and production elements at your fingertips. With 3 tiers to choose from based on your sound design needs. The Creator's Access Plan is perfect for the independent creator working on a smaller scale, looking for high-quality sound options at a great price. With up to 100 downloads, you'll enjoy significant savings compared to buying individual sounds. And you'll have free reign over Sound Idea's extensive collection. Use the promo code TONEBENDERS50 for 50% off any Sound Idea's annual membership to amplify your future productions. Tonebenders is produced by me, Timothy Muirhead. Theme music is by Jim Guthrie. You can reach me via email through info@tonebenderspodcast.com. Follow Tonebenders on Instagram to stay on top of new episodes. If you like the show, you can help us out by spreading the word to your friends and colleagues. Or leave us a tip. Just go to tonebenderspodcast.com and click support. Thanks for listening.